begin. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today for this month's Classical Wisdom webinar, where we'll be talking about Stoicism and Buddhism. Are they the two sides of the same coin? My name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. For those of you who are new to classical wisdom, you can check us out at our website, classicalwisdom.substack.com. We have a free newsletter, we've got podcasts, we do all sorts of stuff, kind of illustrating the value and applicability of ancient history, wisdom, philosophy, literature, mythology, which is not only interesting and engaging in and of itself, but has survived history for good reason and has lots of wonderful lessons for us in the here and now. So on that note, we will be talking about the ancient philosophies of Stoicism and Buddhism, and I'd like to welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Benjamin B. Olshin. He is a research associate at Bryn Mawr College and former professor of philosophy, history, and philosophy of science and technology and design at the University of Arts in Philadelphia. Dr. Olshin is a scholar of history and philosophy of science and technology, a musician, an artist, and an author of several books, including Lost Knowledge, Deciphering Reality, The Mysteries of Marco Polo Maps. He studied the classics, Stoic philosophy, specifically Taoism and Buddhism, and has lived in Japan and Taiwan. And I've always loved talking to Benjamin because he has really good insights. And he's very interdisciplinary, which is wonderful when we're kind of comparing different things, because I know a lot of traditions in modern academia is to kind of become very niche and very specialized. And sometimes it's so you miss the forest and the trees when you don't get the opportunity to take a step back and take a lot of different traditions and knowledges and look at them kind of comprehensively. So that is really Benjamin's skill perfectly for this conversation. So thank you so much, Benjamin, for joining us today.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for attending. I was looking in the chat and I'm really impressed. There are people really from everywhere: Melbourne, Finland, the US, Brazil. Bem-vindo dos brasileiros também, etc. So that's great. And I'm glad people are interested in this topic. Let me do a very quick self-introduction, just because I think it's good for people to know who is this guy that purports to talk about this stuff. So when you hear Anya's introduction, sounds very impressive on paper. The reality is, yes, I am those things, but also, given the topic in particular, I'm pretty modest about my knowledge, and I want to explain how I got interested in this. So I was a classics major. I did do Latin, I did Greek, and then I had a particularly good teacher of Stoicism, this guy, Brad Inwood, who's actually world famous. He's at Yale now. And he got me really interested in Stoicism. And then just through the accidents of fate, I ended up living in Japan for a while and then Taiwan for a while. So I became exposed particularly to Buddhism, but also Taoism. And then a number of years after that, I was at University of Hawaii for a while. I did a summer program at the East-West Center. And I had two really of the best teachers in the world there: Roger Ames, who's a famous translator, particularly of Taoist material, and also Peter Hershock, who's an expert on Buddhism. So I've really been exposed
to with me, but I just
really good people, and I have to give credit to that. And in addition, where I taught here in Philadelphia, I worked with a guy named Steve Antonoff, who's a Zen expert who had lived in Japan for a long time. He did his PhD in religion at Temple University. So I won't say through osmosis, but through interaction with these people, I've learned a great deal. And then, as Anya knows, I'm just interested in general in philosophy and history of philosophy and development of philosophical thought. So that's how I got where we are today. And it was actually Anya's idea to do this topic. And I thought, this is great, because I just finished teaching a course on Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism, and then Stoicism. I naively did not know that Stoicism is really hot now, and it's all over the internet. So I spent the past week reading sort of popular blogs about Stoicism. So I'm ready to go, and Anya and I are going to do a bit of sort of question and then dialogue and diatribe about this. So I don't know if Anya wants to throw the first question out. Then we
can... No, it's perfect. And just to say, I love that, Benjamin, you didn't realize that it'd become trendy. That that's the just to finalize that the as you mentioned, the order of events, we're gonna go through now. We have so much stuff to talk about, so we'll try to stay on track as much as we can, but there is just so much interesting things, and we will be taking questions throughout. So we will address those questions though in like about 45 minutes. So if you can put questions in the chat, Sean will be collecting them and getting them ready for me, and we'll read them out at the end and go over them with Benjamin. But I also just before we get started, while I've still got your attention, just to let you know, the next event we will have is in a little bit less than a month from now. It will be on August 7th, and we'll be discussing the Hymn of Demeter with Diane Ryer and Griffin Gonzalez. So it's a very different subject of mythology, but absolutely fundamental to the ancient world is the Hymn of Demeter. So I think it will be really, really fascinating. So on to today's topic. I'm going to turn it back over to Benjamin, and we're going to start off with these two different philosophies. How were they founded? How did they begin? And were they created in a sort of similar social, political, and cultural context?
All right, so good question. So I'm going to try to keep to a pattern here where I talk about Stoicism first and then Buddhism, just for the sake of the audience. It's always 1-2. So Stoicism arises when a lot of different Greek philosophical schools are arising, Epicureanism, etc. And Stoicism kind of arises as a reaction, in some sense, to Epicureanism, which is a philosophy of leading a good life, a modest but good life. And Stoicism is a little bit more austere. I don't want to use that word too much because it's not the modern definition of Stoicism. The original philosophy is different. The original philosophy really arises as a kind of way, I like to say, of navigating a different political time. And particularly we see that under Marcus Aurelius, who's probably the most famous promoter of Stoicism. If you live in a time of instability, you have two choices: a comforting philosophy, which they don't go for, or a philosophy that allows you to navigate through. So Stoicism arises in a time when you need to navigate a lot of uncertainty socially, culturally, etc. And Stoicism kind of says two things then when it appears, in this period dating essentially from Zeno of Citium all the way through Epictetus, through to Marcus Aurelius, and now into the present. And it arises to say that basically that there is some pattern in the universe and that your job is to observe it and abide by it. And we'll talk about that. Buddhism arises in a different way. Buddhism really arises in a highly developed culture, obviously, that's primarily Hindu, and there are other religions as well. It's a different part of the world. And Buddhism really arises not to address a particular social issue or social circumstance, which it does later, but it arises almost just as an alternative to existing theistic philosophies. It's a philosophy that's very grounded in the pragmatic existence of day to day. And that's something also we're going to see that is very similar, is that both philosophies are grounded in pragmatism. So maybe they are cultural responses to cultures that are very theistic, very driven by highly organized religions, etc. They don't react against those, but they react as sort of an alternative to those.
Now, I think what's really fundamental to both of these philosophies, and I don't know if we should kind of do a bit more of an outline of, I don't know, the history of Buddhism as well, or how that kind of came to be. But the core value of them is virtue. So maybe we can talk a little bit about how virtue and conduct and the self, but maybe we can flesh out a little bit more for Buddhism to kind of give it the background.
Right. So Stoicism, very briefly, just promotes this very explicitly as a value to be pursued, being virtuous, and we'll define that. Buddhism, it's a little bit more complex. So in the history of Buddhism, sort of the classical narrative, we have Prince Siddhartha, who undergoes this enlightenment. And his enlightenment essentially is that the nature of existence, life is suffering. Again, not a great word, but really that life is terminal, right? That it's mitigated by sickness, old age, and death, right? His big observations. And so he asks, how does one, again, navigate that? And the answer is similar. So what we have in Buddhism are the Four Noble Truths that he realizes, that life is suffering. In reaction to suffering, we end up grasping. That's the cause of our discomfiture. And then there's a way to address this, the middle path. And then the Four Noble Truths that he's just outlined are then matched by this kind of eightfold way, which is basically right mind, right action, right speech. It's virtue. So it's virtuous behavior. So in this sense, these philosophies are really similar. They present this pragmatic scenario. And in Buddhism, which we're assuming people are less familiar with, the answer is then, within Buddhist lifetime, one of his sermons is this way of living, this eightfold path, which is basically virtue ethics. Like in every situation, think the right thing, say the right thing, be compassionate, etc. So virtue is really paramount to these philosophies. And one other thing I want to add before we sort of move on, I'm going to throw in a few critiques here, is that I told Anya one of my big sort of bête noirs is that Buddhism has become very corrupted in the way it's understood by a lot of people and in popular culture. And one of the things that's misunderstood is the virtue aspect. So people look at it as a philosophy to feel good, but really it's much more, as a friend of mine always says, about being good, and that's hard. Both these philosophies point out how hard it is to be virtuous, given our emotional nature, given the vagaries of existence, etc.
Now, I think it's also interesting to point out, just from the fundamentals of understanding these two philosophies, in case people are sort of new to either of them. In both instances, you kind of have a way of living one's life, but there isn't a central God. Buddha is not supposed to be worshipped as a god or anything. He's supposed to be a role model and a teacher, in the same way that I think for people who really enjoy studying Stoicism, Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, Zeno, like it's very specifically about having these role models and people to kind of teach you how to live and address these difficulties in life. So that's something that I think is kind of very similar when we're kind of looking at these two philosophies, and that you have these concepts of virtue in the Buddhist way, the Four Noble Truths, and of course, for those who might not be very familiar with Stoicism, also has sort of the four main virtues of temperance and whatnot. That these kind of the idea of simplifying to these basic fundamental virtues is very important to both of these ways of thinking. But I think what is an interesting contrast between Stoicism and Buddhism at this moment would be the concept of self. And maybe you can elaborate about that a bit.
Well, two things. I want to address something else you said prior, and then I'll talk about self. So the idea of a role model is a little bit tricky, because in Buddhism, there's this very explicit idea, in fact, that a role model is something you're not going to find. And there's a famous sort of later in Buddhist history, the Zen idea of, if you meet the Buddha in the road, kill him. And that's a very famous Zen saying. And basically what it's saying is that if you think you found a teacher, you haven't, because everyone's on the road to understanding. And if you yourself think that you found enlightenment and have become worthy of being a role model, you haven't, you're deceiving yourself. In Stoicism, it's a little bit more complicated, because you certainly have a history, a legacy of teachers, etc., and you can admire people. But Buddhism is pretty strict about this. And again, it's something that I think is not well understood. The concept of self, though, is very important. And this was something that Anya and I had sort of traded emails about that I found interesting, is that in Stoicism, there's no explicit discussion of the self or non-self philosophically. However, it's made very clear in Stoic writing that the self is just a conglomeration of atoms. Remember, we're dealing with the Greeks, who had atomic theory, the theory of at least that matter was made of single elements. And so in Stoicism, there's this kind of wink that you as a self are nothing more than things that have come together. that will then dissipate again. In Buddhism, it's a little bit more sophisticated in the sense that they investigate why we have this sense of self, a very strong sense of self. And I noticed somebody in the chat has already asked about like emotions and the fact that we're emotional beings, etc. So Buddhism has a much bigger project of saying that the self is both temporary, which it is, and the Stoics say it's temporary, but also even when it seems to be occurring in this present corporeal form, it is illusory. It's illusory. And in a way, I guess the shortcut answer then is in Buddhism, the ultimate idea is that there's no self at any time. So all these reactions, all these emotions we have, all this suffering, this attempt to grasp is absurd because there's no self to do the grasping. And this could merit a whole nother program, but let me just put it this way, that Zen Buddhism, which comes later in the history of Buddhism, its main goal is addressing this issue of non-self. In Stoicism, there is this idea of self, but again, it's addressed by saying it's temporary. It's an impermanent conglomeration of things that will dissipate, and we should realize it as such.
Yeah, it's very interesting though, because the concept of self is, well, it's definitely something I think for modern people, we don't think about as much, the idea that we should like dissolve the sense of self, like the idea of self in a very individualistic society, and culture is kind of very fundamental. So I think that's definitely one element that makes us a little bit separate from understanding Buddhism, whereas maybe Stoicism can be a little bit more relatable in that way. Now, you kind of mentioned a little bit about the existence, so maybe we can get into more about how they see even the existence of nature, because this is, again, I love that we're kind of going back and forth, and I hope everybody's maybe familiar enough with the two philosophies to kind of go back and forth. If you're not, let me know, but that it's kind of, there's so much to cover. So kind of taking each segment of it. But this is really interesting. And I think a lot of people think about the practical elements of Stoicism and Buddhism popularly without really getting the opportunity to look at sort of the fundamental perspectives of these two beliefs. So yeah, let's get into the nature of existence. It's just a small task,
Right. So the nature of existence, when we talk about that, we're really talking about existentialism in the true sense of that word with a small e, which is, what does it mean to exist, to be alive, in fancy philosophical terms, or kind of ontological state. And I noticed somebody had written in the chat, I know we're not getting to those comments yet, but the comments are very apt, some of them. And somebody said that, it seems that this idea of no self is kind of similar to the Stoic idea where we are part of a continuum of the past and present and future. So let me address this first. So the sense of self in that way, and this will lead to discussion of existence, really what it is that the self is what's called an arising. Okay, so it's a manifestation. And this is an idea that the Buddhists actually borrow from the Taoists, that again, much like the Stoics who say that there are these atoms in sort of the grand scheme of the universe that somehow combine together to form this person, Bob, that woman, Anya, that tree, etc. So in Buddhism, borrowed from Taoism, you have this idea that the sort of substrata of the universe occasionally will come together to manifest as something. And you find this in Native American beliefs as well. It's a really, really interesting idea. Even then, it's a temporary arising and dissolution. Okay, so that's part A. Now, the nature of existence then is, though, connected to that. So Marcus Aurelius in the Meditations writes, for example, he says, death, like birth, is a mystery of nature. The one is a joining together of the same elements into which the other is dissolving, right? So that's it right there. That's atomic theory. So for the Stoics, the nature of existence really is this coming together, dissipation, coming together and dissipation. And that part of this Stoic appeal to reason is that we understand that intuitively, because we don't. We tend to think we're immortal. We tend to think our identity is so important. We tend to think that our atoms are not the same atoms as the dog across the street or the grass or the stars, etc. Now, Buddhism is interesting, is that Buddhism kind of tips its hat very quickly to this idea of manifest arising and then dissolution, but particularly in the original Buddhist doctrine, the original Buddhist scriptures, almost no attention is paid to metaphysics at all. And then in fact, there's something in the Buddhist scriptures, which I don't want to cite at length, where Buddha even says, all those metaphysical questions are great, but they're ridiculous. And he tells this great story of a man who's shot with an arrow. And he says, does that man ask, where's this arrow from and who shot it and why did it enter at this angle? He says, no, the guy just wants to pull the arrow out and feel better. And that's kind of encapsulates the Buddhist attitude towards metaphysics, that it's a waste of time, but even more than that, it's pernicious, that if we spend time worrying about that, we're not going to understand things.
And just to point out, that's such a contrast from the Judeo-Christian traditions where, focusing on the origin stories is so critical. And people spend, a lot of time thinking about how the universe began, the beginning of our civilizations, the beginning of our humanities and all that stuff. So to realize that both Buddhism and Stoicism don't think about the origins of the universe is an interesting point. I hadn't realized that till we were kind of talking about before, that was such a contrast to other religions and other belief systems.
Hugely so, which is one of the reasons why Buddhism is so appealing. There's a famous book called The Jew in the Lotus, not the jewel in the lotus, but The Jew in the Lotus. And it's an account of how Jewish people, particularly I think it's set in like 1970s California, were highly attracted to a philosophy that did not have this metaphysical sort of burden on it. And that's a fascinating issue in and of itself as well. To be fair, though, even in Asian philosophy, Buddhism starts getting these metaphysical, what's it called, accretions, and it gets sort of mired into Tibetan stuff, which most Westerners are very familiar with, which have a whole, what's it called, a whole sort of panoply of gods, etc.
Yep.
Oh, sorry.
No.
So even Buddhism in the East starts getting this metaphysical baggage. It's very hard to maintain a philosophy that sets that aside. So that's interesting, but Anya is absolutely right that this is a huge contrast. One other thing I want to say about the nature of existence too, because again, somebody wrote something very apt in the chat. There is an idea in Stoicism of self and whole. So the Stoics take this from an older Greek idea that the universe itself has this grand logos, right? This sort of mind, or nous, sometimes it's called, and that we are part of this grand cloud, right? And that it may come down in the form of an individual, a single soul, and then go back up in the world soul. This is a very common idea in Greek philosophy. In Buddhism, you find that in certain variants of Buddhism as well, that a self is a sort of a breaking off, a little sort of piece of a universal soul. But again, you don't find that in sort of, what I like to stick to, which is the original Buddhist doctrine, which again is really pragmatic, which is about navigating the temporary nature of our existence, our mortality, sickness, and death, right? Old age, sickness, and death. So go ahead, please.
No, there's just so much. And I was just looking over some of the questions that people have been sending in as well, and they look really, really good. So I want to make sure we definitely have time to get to those. So I do want to move on to suffering, because that is so fundamental to Buddhism, and I think is very applicable to Stoicism, but it's also just a practical thing. Like, we will suffer in our lives at some point, even hypothetical suffering, which is something, of course, the Stoics address. So how do they approach it in its relationship to wants? What causes suffering? And maybe another just additional question for my own self, because I think it's interesting at times to also compare these two to maybe the more familiar Judeo-Christian tradition that many people know about. Does suffering have any value or worth? So I've
right.
given you a three-parter.
All right, so let me invert that. The Judeo-Christian view is sort of the simplest, but the most problematic, which says that suffering exists for sure, but it's part of some divine plan which we have to unpack. And all kinds of philosophies arise then to address that. Manichaeism, Kabbalism, all kinds of cryptic forms of Christianity. So that's, again, a whole other program. So Stoicism and Buddhism are a little bit easier in that sense. So let me start with Stoicism. Stoicism really says that the suffering is not suffering, it's just the world plays itself out in this way, and that the problem is with us, and I'm looking at my notes here, we have both desires and aversions, and we tend to try to avoid, as Epictetus says, sickness or death or poverty. And these attempts to sort of avoid A and go after B are what makes us miserable. So the suffering is our emotional reaction to what are just the vagaries of life. Again, it's changing nature, etc. So the suffering is not really suffering. The suffering is really the formation of thoughts and emotions in an attempt to control these things that just occur in nature. Now, again, I always used to have to tell students that it's not a doctrine of passivity. It doesn't just say go with the flow, because you do have a body, you do have a mind. You can avoid, getting hit with a ball that's being thrown at you. I was just talking to my daughter about that. You can do that, but there are other things that are not in your control. And particularly if we're looking at the ancient world, where death and sickness were much more apt to come and take you without apparent rhyme or reason or recourse, then you would have to have a philosophy where you are accepting, and it's that accepting that's avoiding suffering. Buddhism, very similar, a little more complicated though, because again, the translation problem, that what is translated as suffering is this term dukkha, D-U-K-K-H-A is usually the way it's romanized. Dukkha really means unease, and it's actually a much better word for modern people, okay? Because we're very lucky in that in many ways we don't have to suffer from what the ancient people suffered, but we have a lot of unease, most of which we cause ourselves in affluent parts of the world. And unease really in Buddhism is our grasping at things. So here you are, you're in this situation where you're mortal, right? That's problem A. And so what do we do as a reaction to that? Make more money, buy a bigger house, get more stuff, right? Have more affairs, do stuff like that. And so the suffering, in this case, the dukkha, is that unease that we've developed given our mortal situation. Whereas if we face the mortal situation in a much more Buddhistic way, which is with compassion, acceptance, using the time we have, doing our best, right mind, right action, etc., the suffering is alleviated. So the suffering that the Buddhists talk about is that unease of our constant sort of emotional dissatisfaction. And two, the Stoics, particularly Marcus Aurelius, talks about this very explicitly. What is it that hurts us, things or our emotional reactions to things? So both philosophies, and I want to make this clear, are not talking about austerity. They're actually talking about an attempt to be reasonable, which is very difficult for us to understand. I mean, I always tell students, I teach this stuff, I don't practice it. It's very hard to be non-emotional. But on the other hand, you can clearly see the thoughtfulness of these philosophies, that so much of our misery comes from forming these strong, and particularly now when we live in a society where politics has become very emotional too, that we form these strong emotional reactions to things that then prevent us from really just living life as it should be lived. And that's what both these philosophies are pointing towards.
Now, I think it's next good to go into the natural order of and how they approach it. And again, it's very fascinating because you say like they're very pragmatic at times, and there are kind of fundamentals that they both share with regards to understanding how things just should be. So, and how we should approach them. So let's go into logos and dharma.
Right. So logos is a Greek word and an ancient Greek word. And again, it predates Stoicism, and you find it in all kinds of places. You find it a lot in Plato, etc. And logos is translated literally as word, like sometimes just a word, right? Logos, word, but also thought, reason, etc. Reason, which is the most philosophical translation, is still very problematic because for us, reason is almost kind of pejorative. Like we say, oh, you're so reasonable, which is kind of a diss, right? It's saying that you're unfeeling. But what logos really is in these philosophies, particularly in Stoicism, let's start with that, it's the kind of driving pattern and force of the universe. So Marcus Aurelius says that wisdom, living a good life, wisdom consists in knowing, quote, that the logos extends through the whole of matter and governs the universe for all eternity according to certain fixed periods and principles. So it's this idea, it's the only metaphysics that Stoicism really gets into. It's saying like, yeah, there's a pattern. All right. And for the Stoics, it's kind of obvious, like it is for Plato, et cetera. It's like, obviously there's weather, there's the cosmos, there has to be a pattern, right? These people are not believers in chaos. In Buddhism, they similarly adopt a kind of existing term. So the Stoics adopt logos, the Buddhists adopt dharma, which again is a tricky term, but it's a pre-existing term. It appears in Hinduism, Sikhism, etc. But one of the translations of dharma is same thing. It's the way things are, the universal pattern or the way. In Chinese, you have Tao, right? Which is the Taoist thing. Tao means street or road or way or way making or pattern. It's very similar idea. So both philosophies kind of have to predicate or work from some unfolding pattern in the universe. Unlike Judeo-Christian tradition, to get back to Anya's other comment, there's no value attached to it. It just is what it is. It's just nature unfolding, which is very different from the later theistic ideas, particularly of Christianity. So in Stoicism and Buddhism, a key to sort of living life properly is understanding the logos or understanding dharma. And again, this is something I think that's really misunderstood in modern interpretations, particularly of Buddhism, that my term is like 99% of your time should be spent just observing, 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 and observing, because it takes a lot to understand the way things actually play out because we're so immersed in our own preconceptions of things, or as I often talk with my daughter about the way we're schooled to understand things, which are part of the illusion, right, of self, etc. So I hope that's a good explanation.
Well, and it's interesting too, because like you said, the idea that there's natural order of things, and Stoicism does very much believe in fate as well. And that concept is very fundamental to it. Does Buddhism also have the ideas of fate embedded in it?
Well, Stoicism, to be careful again, because fate, English words are so loaded, and this is always a problem with translation, and it's been great to work with translators over the years. Fate implies a script scripted by somebody who knows, right? That there's some sort of anthropomorphic quality. In the Stoic view, really, fate is just the way the universe plays out. It's almost like, if you wanted to look at it another way, it's like Newtonian physical law. And I think it's Epictetus, I have this in my notes, who says that life is like the way the playwright wants it. And that's the closest that Stoicism comes to saying that there's some figure there, right, who's doing this. But even then, it's really not being anthropomorphized. In Buddhism, there's also this idea that there is a fate, but again, it's not being scripted in any way. It's like, of course, everything has a fate. The seasons are going to change. Is that fate? No, that's just natural pattern. So I tend to avoid using the word fate because it's too loaded. I prefer to use the term that both philosophies have a natural pattern and playing out of things, but scripted by no one or nothing or whatever. And that's, again, a whole different kettle of fish.
Can I just say that was one of the nicest and clearest explanations of Stoicism and fate that I've heard in a long time. I really appreciate that because I think it is definitely one of those points of often misunderstanding, misinterpretation, and people sort of, I don't know, taking it for what they want it to be rather than necessarily how it was originally intended to be understood. But I'd like to go on and we'll get to our questions very shortly. But I want to ask, what are the aspects of it that make Stoicism and Buddhism so popular today? Like, why have they enjoyed this resurgence of interest and renown?
Stoicism, again, it was sort of new to me that it was so popular. Again, I just found out that it was popular among people of certain political beliefs, let's say, and certain age groups, mainly my former students who are like in their 30s. I think Stoicism, it's an easier answer that it's popular now because it provides an interesting philosophy in times of lots of political uncertainty, because it's about how do I enjoy life when people are such a royal pain and so difficult and so cranky. So I like it myself for that reason. Buddhism is more complicated because Buddhism has kind of entered Western culture and retreated from it in various times, obviously in the 60s and 70s, and then it's sort of dissipated and then it's come back. I don't find that Buddhism is particularly in the zeitgeist now as much. And again, to be fair, if you live in Eastern culture, like I spent a lot of time in Taiwan, it's not as if everybody's walking around there being a Buddhist. The Buddhism there is very different from our like pure philosophical conception. So I think Buddhism became popular in the 60s and 70s because it was so different from, people's upbringing in traditional Judaism, Catholicism. Half my class is always like people who've drifted away from Catholicism, finding that somehow unsatisfactory. So Buddhism's appeal, I think, is its non-theistic nature, right, in most forms, the fact that there's no God, and that it apparently promises some kind of happiness. And I'm being very qualified in that statement. You see the Buddha is sit on my left or my right here. One side is Marcus Aurelius, the other side is Buddha. Buddha is often depicted as smiling, and I think that appeals to people because Jesus, if you're brought up in a Christian tradition, is not usually smiling. Although, again, that's a misinterpretation, I think, of Christianity, that it's this dour, negative religion. But to answer your question, Buddhism has a lot of appeal because people want to be happy. Our culture, modernity, I would argue, this is another place I'll drop my opinion in, works very hard against happiness because it's a culture that's built on dissatisfaction. That's what drives the economy. So Buddhism is a nice antidote to that. It's saying, yes, I can be happy without stuff, without lots of money, etc. So that's why Stoicism is popular, because of the current socio-political climate, and Buddhism, when it rises in popularity, as it does periodically, it's because people are unhappy and they're looking to be happy.
Now, one thing I wanted to address kind of next, and I've seen people talking about it, is the idea of like Zen and mindfulness. And I think that's another part of it that is its appeal. And one of the very first questions, actually from, I think it was Mark, that says, is meditation's important in Buddhism, but what about Stoicism? So maybe we can address the Zen mindful meditation trilogy.
Right.
Regulation.
So let me start with the sort of the Stoicism. Stoicism, it also advocates kind of meditative state. Marcus Aurelius has this great epigram where he says, you don't need to retreat to the mountains or the beach to find calm. You can find that within yourself. I mean, it's a meditative line. It's a beautiful line. So they have that idea, but the idea, as one of the commentators in the chat correctly says, that idea is more a sort of a rational, reasonable calm, right? Just understanding that I can retreat from my emotional reactions to things, from the world outside. Buddhism, particularly the Zen aspect of Buddhism, is a much more complex thing because its ultimate goal, particularly in Japanese Zen, is the total dissolution of self. And in fact, it's multi-phase. So it's like the Stoic thing of not reacting emotionally. Then it's, oh, here's myself. Look at me. I'm so great. I'm not reacting emotionally. Oh, wait, there's still a self. Now let me get rid of that. And I just taught a great Zen text where it talks about that, about having to get all the way down to where there's no meditator anymore either. So whoever said that in the chat gets this idea, and hopefully I've captured that well. I should point out historically, because Anya seems interested in history, it's important that Zen comes later in the history of Buddhism as a kind of strand of Buddhism that's attempting to really get at a resolution of this self thing. Because Siddhartha talks about it, but Zen arises saying that the way to do this is through meditation. So the character for Zen in Japanese is the same as the character in Chinese. And I think we have a few Chinese speakers in the audience here, Chan, which means to meditate. It's just the verb to meditate. So Zen meditation is kind of redundant. So the idea behind Zen Buddhism is that through meditation, through quiet sitting, zazen, we will be able to get to this ultimate process of dissolution of self. So yeah, they're similar, but they're also different because the Buddhist project takes it much farther. In fact, takes it to the ultimate thing, right? The dissolution of self.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you think in some ways Stoicism advocates the opposite when, with the journaling or that kind of stuff, you're like, meditate, but about yourself, how did you act during the day? What should you be held accountable for? How could you make yourself better? But you are in those thoughts. I mean, they're kind of central to how you're supposed to reflect.
Right. And also Stoicism has a kind of mechanical Zen anyway, in the sense that, yeah, we're atoms, we're going to dissolve. So it kind of doesn't have to spend philosophically a lot of time on that idea, because it says, yeah, we're going to disappear anyway. You don't need to meditate on that. You need to meditate on behaving well, good conduct, virtue, etc. Right? That's what you really need to be doing in terms of your temporary incarnation.
I love taking these kind of terms and ideas and concepts that we get so regularly today, like meditation or mindfulness, and discussing it in context of the actual philosophies, which brings me to the next question from Nadinia. What is the fundamental difference between Buddhism and Stoicism in the context of karma?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And I hadn't really written that in my notes. And I will say, let me think, what's the program called? Not to refer you to other programs, but on BBC4, write this down, BBC4, there's a wonderful program called In Our Time, which I'm sure.
Oh, I love In Our Time.
Right. It's an awesome program. And they just did an episode on karma. And you should all listen to that program. And they have some, people talking about the nature of karma. Karma, again, would merit a whole other program. In Buddhism, and I know I'm going to get attacked for this, I feel that karma is brought in from the Hindu tradition, that it's not really part of the primary doctrine of Buddhism, which is about conduct for the sake of making our present lives better for those around us, compassion. Karma, particularly as it's understood now, is about rewards and punishments and actions, etc. And I don't really feel that exists when you look in the primary Buddhist doctrine. Similarly, in Stoicism, it's funny that they seem to step aside a lot of even the Greek ideas about soul and rebirth and reincarnation, because that exists, and karmic ideas certainly exist in the ancient tradition. You find that in Pythagoras, for example, etc. And absolutely, the Stoics were aware of Pythagoras and understood his ideas. Plato understands his ideas. But it's funny, it doesn't seem to play a big role in Stoicism either. It's really about pragmatic, compassionate, virtuous action in the present. So say I. All right, I'm going to be modest again in that. So.
Well, it is interesting, having just had the opportunity of traveling around a lot of different Southeast Asian countries to compare, the Buddhist temples would be, depending on how much influence they had from Hinduism, or Taoism, looked very different. And you can see those direct influences in the Laotian temples compared to the Malaysian temple, and it's just really interesting, or Thai and the Vietnamese ones, that you can see the history of Buddhism, how it has interacted with the local culture, or when it was introduced, it kind of has a different expression, which of course makes sense, and that maybe Stoicism would never have had as much of that Hindu influence, as you mentioned.
Well, what happens is, I'm just writing this in the chat, just the term, before I forget, is syncretic religion. So all religions undergo this syncretic process where they combine things. So my wife, who's from Taiwan, she and I have had this argument a million times where she goes, oh, these are Buddhist temples in Taiwan. I'm like, well, they're not really, because they have a statue of Confucius, and they have a statue of the Buddha, who said, never make a statue of me. So all religions get this kind of conglomeration of stuff. Judaism probably less than a lot of others for various doctrinal reasons. But even Islam, I was surprised, if you go to Turkey, the forms of Islam in Turkey are so syncretic in terms of having pre-Islamic stuff mixed in, a lot of mystical, even pagan things thrown into the mix. That's the nature of the way humans work. I won't say a philosopher, but as a philosophically minded person, like to try to find some bit of the pure philosophy, because I think the syncretism is what screws us up a lot, in the sense that, for example, we want Buddhist philosophy in its pure form, but then we want it to be this kind of feel-good religion. It's like, well, no, you got to take it for what it is. It's like, taking chocolate-covered vitamins. You just can't do that. It doesn't work. But you will observe that absolutely. If you travel, you will see Buddhist temples that are all over the place in terms of the iconographic content. Absolutely.
So I guess this sort of leads me into the next question from Rodrigo, that are there any other items of evidence of interaction between Greek culture and Buddhism, other than the Greco-Buddhist sculptures and the dialogue between Bactrian Greek monarchs of the Afghanistan region and a Buddhist monk?
This is a question from somebody in the audience?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's the killer question that is asked a lot by historians and anthropologists, etc. I'll give you my answer, since I'm not an anthropologist. There was probably some contact, but my own pet theory, my conjecture, is that these models could just as well have arisen completely independently. Why? Because the human condition, to any observant person, just bears itself so explicitly and so immediately. So one of the things I love about Buddhism is that the Buddha's great insight is so obvious. It's like, yeah, people get sick, they get old, and they drop dead. But only in Buddhism is there kind of the wherewithal to make something of that. Similarly, in Stoicism, I particularly like Marcus Aurelius, because he's the emperor, right? The emperor of all things. And even he realizes, like, God, we're ridiculous. We are so foolish to have emotional reactions to things, to be interested in fame, etc. And so I think any human being, and certainly this has been my experience, and I've been all over the world, anybody who stops for a second and pulls out of modernity and just looks around sees these problems. So even if there were historical interchanges, it was probably among people who had realized this stuff separately already. I mean, Anya and I have never met, and yet somehow we came together because we drifted into this stuff separately. So it's the same idea.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. And I mean, you definitely have lots of anthropological evidence of that in other fields, like, agriculture or development. I mean, that, whether it's the wheel or fire, things like that, I mean, they do kind of naturally happen organically. But I do think that there is often more interactions between ancient peoples than we might realize or appreciate, and the seeds of ideas can be carried very easily sometimes. So I think, I can see both sides.
Right, and that's why I say I think historically you find evidence for this in terms of, well, certainly you had mentioned that we know that art styles are transmitted all over. I mean, they do think, just as a quick aside now, that even those the famous terracotta warriors, now they think there was Greek influence in the sculpting of the faces of those. So no, I don't dismiss that at all, but I'm saying that to me though, it's still people struggling with the same problems. But there's cultural transmission of ideas of all kinds, artistic, philosophical, etc., without doubt.
Now, this next question is, I think, an interesting one. It's very practical, so maybe both the Stoics and the Buddhists will appreciate it. This one comes from Becca. We've talked a lot about the misunderstandings and misinterpretations of Buddhism, which is also, as anybody who enjoys Stoicism, very common there as well. If we come across a wrong version, one that has gotten skewed, A, how will we know? And B, what should we do? For example, when you said about if somebody says that they know the answers, they don't, ditto with Stoicism. How do we get to the heart of it? And I'm starting to look more into Stoicism and Taoism as well. So, but let's focus. What do you do when you find misinterpretations of Stoicism and Buddhism?
Well, I mean, how can I avoid sounding cynical? My assumption is that most presentations are going to be misrepresentations or misunderstandings. Let me tell you a positive story. So I went to University of Hawaii for this summer program, and one of the instructors was this guy, Roger Ames, and he's translated the Tao Te Ching. He's a very famous translator. He's Canadian. And I asked Roger lots of questions. I was so excited. I said, Roger, tell me this, tell me that. And I myself was already in my 40s. I wasn't a young student. And every question I asked him, he answered with a question. So I asked him something about something in this Taoist work. He goes, what do you think? So he's like a psychiatrist. And that gave me a very good feeling because it was somebody who's so knowledgeable, who himself was always questioning and doubting, etc. So if you're going to read a book, and I certainly have books that I swear by that I think are really like better interpretations, etc. But the book itself, its whole tone should be conjectural, questioning, modest, etc. So that's one way to look at it. The other thing, as a scholar, I say, is try to always go to the primary sources. So there are Buddhist scriptures that don't date to the time of Siddhartha, but are very early. I think those are worth looking at. There's a great book, if you want more pragmatic suggestions, called What the Buddha Taught, and it's written by a Sri Lankan scholar from, I think, the 50s or 60s. And again, it's a very careful book. It says, we think that this likely means this. We think that this likely means that. With Stoicism, how to get to the heart of it, well, again, I mean, the short answer is just read the primary sources. You can read Epictetus directly. You can read Marcus Aurelius, get the Penguin edition. The translations all differ slightly, but those really are very accessible. It's not like reading Heidegger. And so I always advise, just as a first step, go to the primary sources. With Taoism as well, the two primary sources, and I can do offline, I'm happy to email people and send recommendations. There are two works which you probably should start with, and they're good translations. And yet part of this, the last thing I'll say, is like oneself struggling directly with this material. That's one of the things. It's like misinterpreting it, reinterpreting it. My mind has changed a million times. I taught this stuff for 16 years, and each year I was like, I think this is different. And probably an hour from now, I'll be like, why did I say that online? That was stupid. That's part of the process of always reconfiguring, reconjecturing. I think that's very important. And again, from the Judeo-Christian perspective, that's very hard for us. Like, can we do that? It's like, yeah, it's flux. It's all flux, right? So.
Well, and I think that's always very important. I like to say again and again that when it comes to these great texts, and not just with Stoicism and Buddhism, is that we're not supposed to just take them as gospel. You're supposed to kind of have a conversation with them. And throughout history, some of the greatest minds and part of various different Renaissance and Enlightenments and even the founding fathers, they didn't read all these books and just completely agree with everything they said. They engaged with the ideas. They argued with the ideas. Sometimes you can look at a point and say, you know what, I agree with that. But the idea is to read it and think about it. And, when it comes to, say, the ideas of skepticism, how much of this information do we have? There's so many texts that later on are found out not to be fully real or whatnot, that but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have any value or truth in them also. And that there was a great tradition during like the Renaissance, for instance, where people would try to study and engage with these texts that there were a lot more of then than they are now, and immerse themselves so much in the style and the ideas of these authors that they would copy them, and they would try to make these forgeries, but they weren't making these forgeries necessarily to be to deceive. It was almost like a form of flattery to emulate. But some of these documents can still have real value in them, even though they're not the originals. So just to say, we can still get elements of truth and ideas for things that are removed from the originals.
Well,
We
and I
have to
would,
use our critical faculties, though, to determine what has real value in it.
and if you want to go sort of even further down that road, I would say you can also sort of embody what the Taoists and Buddhists and Stoics did, which is just go out into nature. Because remember, the Buddhist philosophy comes from actually his direct observation of reality. He's out in his carriage and he sees the old man, the sick man, and the dead man. And I used to tell my students that enlightenment or insight may just come from you're walking down the street and seeing a crack in the sidewalk, and that could be the secret to the universe. So I think there's also that sort of non-doctrinal thinking about just direct observation of things in front of you. And yeah, and it could be, it's funny you brought like false sources up as well. I forget what the book is called, some 1960s book where it's about that, like even the totally bogus wizard, whatever, that may be really the key to understanding the trickster, all this kind of stuff. So part of this is understanding that the truth can be in a non-truth, the truth can be in the small scale or the large scale or the book or the non-book, etc. It's a question of being observant and open to that. Absolutely.
So here's another kind of practical question from Mark. Are both Stoicism and Buddhism psychological tools to help us live better without the need for metaphysics?
That's a very good question. And the issue with metaphysics is very complicated. And to be sort of personal, it's something that I've struggled with a lot. So I was really brought up with metaphysical focus. I went to religious school and that's all metaphysics. And then the philosophy I studied was metaphysics. I'm interested in it. The older I get, and I'm reasonably old, the more I think that the metaphysical path is, as the Buddhist scriptures say, useless, right? Now the arrow is stuck in me and I'm debating the origin of the arrow while I'm dying. And so I think that a kind of a focus on these more pragmatic philosophies makes sense. And also we live in an age right now where metaphysics has kind of jammed us up, as we would say here in Philly, because we see what metaphysics has got us. It hasn't resolved issues of war, human behavior, conflict, economic systems. So the metaphysical approach, if I may even say, like the traditional Judeo-Christian metaphysical approach, is just not working. So why not give these more pragmatic philosophies a try? Because certainly they are more functional in the immediate moment, without question, right?
Can I just read a few of these comments because they're so good? What you said about the modern culture is built on dissatisfaction is profound. The dissatisfaction industrial complex is so, that is such a great phrasing for it. Here's another good one that I thought was really interesting. There seems to be a crucial difference between the goals of the two systems. My understanding of samsara, or for Zen Buddhist nirvana, is that it's a state of oceanic feeling of one's ego dissolving into an awareness of the oneness of existence, attained through the breaking down the distractions of the monkey mind, useless chatter, and attachment. The Stoic goal of eudaimonia, on the other hand, as I understand it, is calmness, achieved through reasoning about the true nature of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. I sort of tried to address that in an earlier answer, that the Stoics don't go so far as get rid of the self. So the Stoic goal is sort of a calmness with oneself vis-a-vis the physical universe around us, or the logos or the pattern. Whereas samsara is tricky. It's like, yeah, you want this, well, you shouldn't want, but you are in this process where you become dissipated into the larger whole. But again, even awareness of that as a goal is problematic. Awareness that you're dissipating is problematic. So, Buddha's philosophy carried to the extreme is that the process doesn't really happen, or it happens so autonomously you're not even aware of it. So that's why Buddhism always kind of reels you back. So even samsara is tricky because, again, what happens particularly in modern executions of it, it becomes teleological, right? It becomes goal oriented. Like, I am going to get enlightenment. I'm going to enter samsara. I am going to achieve nirvana, as if it's a thing. And that's why I'm reluctant to endorse any of these particular interpretations, but go for it,
Now, the next question from Paul is actually one that I wrote to you, Benjamin, a few days ago, as I was thinking and preparing for this, and that was the links between Buddhism and Epicureanism. I mean, I think a lot of people do think of Buddhism and Stoicism, but the ancient Greek philosophy of Epicureanism also, there's quite a few correlations. So Paul wrote, I'm thinking about it means to be Epicurean, being originally rather different from the modern sense of the word, being the avoidance of pain rather than seeking of pleasure. So taking something of a middle path in Buddhism. And in that way, I also had thought, like, this seems to be a very striking similarity maybe between these two thought processes.
Yeah, and I think, if the audience understands that Epicureanism is not the same as outlined in that magazine called Epicure, which is all about good food. As long as you understand
or
that,
like an
you're okay.
app.
Yeah, exactly. So I would agree that Epicureanism is really advocating the same idea of a middle path. It's just sort of more of an affirmation that given our temporary conglomeration of atoms into this being, why not enjoy life and engage life? And one of the things that also I wanted to point out that I think I communicated to you at some point was that Buddhism itself, particularly in the original doctrines of Buddhism, advocates this in a way. There's a story which I could not find the original citation to, where Buddha is out on the road and he has this group of followers, and they've come back to him after being away for a while, and they all have shaved heads and orange robes and the begging bowls. And Buddha looks at them and says, "What are you doing?" And they say, "Oh, we followed your advice and we gave up everything. We left our wives and our businesses and our friends, and we became ascetics. We became monks." And Buddha says, "No, no, 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 no. That's not what this is about. It's about living life and being compassionate and kind and right action and right thought, etc." He says, because first of all, that's a lot harder, right? It's a lot harder to live in the world and behave well and compassionately. And second of all, we can't have an existence where everybody's a monk, right? The human existence stops. So even the Buddha, I think, would understand Epicureanism as being functional in the world. I mean, existence, whether you believe it's God-given or just a natural unfolding, has food, it has nice weather, it has bicycles, stuff like that. What am I doing now? I'm watching the Tour de France. It's great. I have TV. You can do those things. That's part of the execution of life. The question, of course, always is moderation, middle path, doing stuff that is non-destructive, etc. And that's difficult to navigate, especially in the modern world, of course.
It's really interesting seeing, going back to Stoicism and Buddhism, the comparison of Buddha and Zeno, that both of them start off extremely wealthy. And Zeno is a rich merchant, Buddha is a rich prince. They then have this moment where they become, with nothing. So Buddha gives up everything and lives this ascetic life. Zeno, gets shipwrecked and starts following Crates, the cynic. And cynicism is much more an ascetic, more extreme style of living. So they both then experience this extreme wealth and then this sort of extreme deprivation of basic wants, even whether it's living in crates. And that's one of the moments in Zeno's life, I think, when he was humiliated with a pot of beans, that he realized, well, this extreme is not good way to live either. And similarly, Buddha then has the moment where I think he eats some rice that a woman gives him and he becomes full again. And so it's interesting to see that both of these sort of founders have the opportunity to experience both extremes and then realize that neither extreme will make them happy.
Right. And again, this kind of middle path is very difficult for us to understand, us moderns. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that, again, we live in a society which has multiple teleological goals. Make as much money as possible, live as well materially as possible, and then be redeemed and go to heaven. So everything is teleological. The capitalist system, the educational system, right? Get the highest degree possible. The economic system, I said the religious system, etc. So this kind of middle path is very difficult for us to understand. But in the ancient world, at least these few thinkers did understand that you don't need austerity because that's non-functional. And you certainly don't need great wealth because that's a distraction from any kind of spiritual epiphany whatsoever, right? Because anytime, if you're very, very wealthy, anytime you have spiritual crisis, you throw money at it, right? And so they realize that that's not functional either. But we just, not to sound like a cynic myself, but we have real difficulty, I think, understanding that we're really enmeshed in a culture where we think that money is going to be the answer in a spiritual sense. And if it's not, then that's okay because I have money. So it's tough. But I agree with you. If you look in the past, those are absolutely the historical lessons laid out, the middle path, as you say.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've spoken to a lot of different people who are really interested in Stoicism, and I remember talking to Justin Steed. He's has the Marcus Aurelius Foundation in London, and he runs he's a CEO of $1 billion purse company in London. And I was talking to him, and I said, I think Stoicism is so valuable for people and has such wonderful tools to help people, especially in times of really difficulty. And he looked at it, he said, I know a lot of people benefited from times of difficulty, but I actually know for myself, it's actually helped me the most at times of great success. And I think for a lot of people, they don't realize that great riches and all that sounds wonderful. And we live in this sort of glamorous, Instagram filled world where we're told that, look at this, if you look like this and you'll be happy. But I mean, even personally, I've spoken to a lot of people at that level, and you don't get happiness by just having wealth. It's not a solution.
But there's another, I should throw in that there's another particularly Buddhist critique of wealth, which is that, we can go around saying that rich people are not always that happy, whatever. I mean, it's pretty obvious to us. I was just reading about Matthew Perry this morning for some reason. But it's more than that, is that Buddhist philosophy would say that the kind of wealth that we see now, or even in the ancient world, is an aberration from the natural order. And the Stoics would probably say the same, vis-a-vis logos. So think about this. A guy I knew had this great way of framing this. It's sort of simplistic, but it's nice. He goes, a squirrel will, during the summer, gather acorns, enough acorns to hold him or her through the winter. Right? You guys are with me on this in the audience, right? Squirrels gather, you see them gathering them up and they hide them in the ground and they gather enough, right? If they don't, they're in trouble. No squirrel, he used to say, is a billionaire. He says no squirrel goes out and just keeps gathering and gathering and gathering and gathering to the point where there's 1 million or 1 billion acorns underground where half of them are rotting, where half of them he doesn't know where he is. And this guy said, only humans accumulate to the point of pathology. And I think that's really important. I think a Stoic would say, yes, that's not in accordance with the logos, because nowhere in nature do we see the extreme accumulation that we see in our world. From a Buddhist perspective, I would suspect that a Buddhist critique similarly would be that it's unnatural, but also that, again, not to sound like a Marxist, but no such accumulation of wealth could occur while still being consistently compassionate, because all such accumulation of extreme wealth requires some kind of exploitative mechanism. Let's just call it a mechanism. Let's not talk about people per se. So I think we would also have to re-examine wealth, a kind of non-Marxist critique of wealth, which again is very tricky to do. I mean, this is tough. You go to Japan and you see the Buddhist monks who make a lot of money carrying out Buddhist funerals. It's very interesting, and they drive fancy cars. So this is, or in Thailand, you see the same thing. This is problematic, but that's sort of, I think, a very interesting way to apply these two philosophies to a pragmatic issue that we face now. Absolutely.
Yeah, and as you say, well, this would probably be a whole other discussion of whether wealth and morality and whatnot,
Right.
which I would love to have, but we probably can't focus on it right now. But definitely food for thought. So I think we've got time for just like one or two more questions. And I do want to ask the one with regards to emotions, because this is always kind of forefront for people when thinking and discussing Stoicism. And so the kind of common question from Costa is, isn't the advantage of Buddhism and Stoicism also the problem with them? Namely, the emphasis on not being guided by our feelings that we can't put words to, but ultimately drive all our choices.
No, I was confused. I saw that question, but I wasn't clear on why that's a problem, like not heeding the emotions. That's what I didn't understand in that question. Like, how is that a drawback?
Well, it's interesting. It's something I often kind of bring up in discussions these days, because I think we're kind of living in a culture where we have, thumos, the spirited righteous anger, and that people, I think, currently feel that passion and emotions can drive change.
Okay. Oh, so it's kind of, the question is like being a little bit wary of this non-emotional response to things. Okay, that's a very good and very difficult question. And if you know the questioner, we'll have to talk further. It's complicated from a couple of perspectives. One is you have to understand what the Stoics and Buddhists are talking about, particularly the Stoics, I'd say, when they're talking about emotions. And remember, the word emotion, right, is also a Greek Latin word, and it's essentially like action, emotive action. And so what it's saying is that emotions don't really have an inherent positive value in these philosophies, because they are reactions to things that essentially come from nothing, or the reactions to things that are illusory. We like emotions because we feel they define us, particularly, again, nowadays. Everybody seems to love being angry. Of all emotions to choose, it's pretty perverse. But what Stoicism and Buddhism are saying, they're not saying be non-emotional. They're saying observe your reactions to things. In Stoicism, particularly, I think it's in Epictetus, he has this great line about, like, yes, you will have a wife, yes, you will have a child, and he says you will have attachments to them. For him, it's understanding that emotions are going to be delimited, right? Because everything is transitory. So it doesn't say don't have an emotional reaction. It says observe them and let them be delimited, delineated by reason. In Buddhism, there's an understanding that we are emotional beings. However, the problem is that the emotions become these things that arise from nothing or in reaction to nothing, and then they guide us to actions that actually cause another emotion, which is unhappiness, right? So that's the problem, that it's the process of emotions themselves that, particularly in the Buddhist viewpoint, they lead us to unhappiness, because we get angry about something, and so then we're angry. Or we get happy about something, like the fact that lunch is going to be served, but then I'm going to be unhappy because it's not the lunch that I wanted, right? And so emotions are these attachments to things that cause problems. So yes, it's against emotions in terms of the process, but it's not against emotions like, oh, I should tamp it all down. It's saying, like, why does this stuff arise in the first place? And I think the discussion, this would merit a whole separate discussion, would have to start with that. Like, what are emotions? Where do they arise? And then what is their functional nature in a human society? And I think the questioner is asking that, and that's a great question. So.
Now, I want to just finish up with one last question, because I know we're kind of reaching the end of our time limit, but this one's a great one. And I think I hope it's not a curveball at the last minute. From Catherine, interesting question about emotion. Art exists to evoke emotional responses. Is there any place for art in these philosophies? And if so, what role does it play?
That's a killer question. And again, this is speaking of like weird fate and karma. It's so funny because I actually have just applied for a grant where I'm dealing with almost this exact question, which is what is the role of art with human beings? So I'm going to give you my 1-minute conjecture answer to this because it's a fantastic question.
Can I just also premise that and in case people don't know, I know that you, Benjamin, are also an artist. I also paint so it's a great question for you specifically as well.
Yeah, and I taught painting and drawing for many years, so I'm not anti-art, man. So what I was telling somebody the other day, I was describing this grant that I've applied for, is that human beings didn't always make art. They started making art only about 50,000 years ago, right? So Homo sapiens, are around, and then 50,000 years ago, they start doing cave painting, carving of bones and tusks, etc. So it's a great mystery why we're making art. My own conjecture, and it's just a conjecture, is that we made art as a way of talking to ourselves because we had to externalize something to reabsorb it. But that unfortunately, and I say this as somebody who makes plenty of art myself, that it's pathological. So art exists, yes, I'm reading the question, to evoke emotional responses, but that's because we're messed up in a way. And I think this is one of the things Buddhism was identifying, that we have this dissonance, that we have to have something external to remind ourselves of who we are as humans to regain holism. And you find this in Taoism, Stoicism, Buddhism, Plato, etc. Art, well, Plato lays this out very clearly. Art is very problematic. So yes, art exists to make emotional responses, but that's a pathology. Like no other animal does that. Other animals are completely holistic in and of themselves. They don't need to make a painting to have the painting talk back to them. And as somebody who critiques student works for years, I saw this. So yeah, I mean, talk to me a year from now and we'll have a whole session on that because that's a tremendous question. Really, really good question.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you go to the temples and you have these beautiful statues just over and over and over again. And you kind of read like, why do they have these, hundreds and hundreds of statues? And is to make you feel calm. So like the very purpose of it is to be this calming influence that is to not evoke pain. And I guess, do you say that it being pathological? I wonder when the transition went from painting, just myths and stories and painting idealized gods or whatnot, something beautiful, to painting things that are supposed to evoke horror or disgust. Like, when did we get to Damien Hirst, and what does that reflect about us? Now, perhaps this is the best time to say finish up. I think Benjamin, you've been so gracious with your time, and I think we've covered quite a lot. I'm really impressed by how much we managed to get through, and I hope it wasn't too much of a whirlwind because I realized that there were so many different ideas to go out. So if you do have more questions or you want us to follow up on a specific element of the discussion, feel free. You can email me or I can forward it to you to Benjamin, or he can let you contact him directly. I will point you out to our follow-up email to all of Benjamin's great books as well. I really enjoyed the maps of Marco Polo. It's a completely different topic, but still absolutely fascinating. And I just want to say thank you again to everybody for joining us. You have been an excellent audience. I've really enjoyed your questions. I thought they were really thought-provoking. And just one last reminder that we will have our next event August 7th at noon EST, and we will be discussing the Hymn of Demeter with Griffin Gonzalez and Diane Rayer. So I will send you a follow-up email with this video, links, and everything. Thank you again, and I'll let you, Benjamin, say last words.
Yeah, just thank you for hosting this. Thank you to the audience. Thanks for the great comments and questions. And yeah, please send any follow-up questions to Anya. I'm happy to answer everything, anything, and send book recommendations, etc. I just always feel that's sort of the duty of a person who speaks on these things. And thank you for spending an hour and a half with me of your valuable time. So, cool.
And one last special thanks to Sean Kelly, our managing editor and classicist himself, always helping out. So much appreciated. And thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.